بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة العالمين سيدنا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا شفيع قائد الغر المحجلين وشفيع المذنبين وسيدي ولد آدم الفخر محمد بن عبد الله الهاشمي القرشي وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه ثم أما بعد. So alhamdulillah, we're reading from our sessions entitled The Journey is the Destination, the Path of the Arifin. And as I said previously, we could have just as easily entitled it The Path of the Arifin, or The Path of the Muhibbin, or The Path of the Salihin, or The Path of the Muqarrabin. So those who are near to God, those who are righteous, those who love what Allah loves, including our Prophet ﷺ. These are all attributes of the Arif. وإثار الحق على الخلق, and to prefer the haqq, to prefer the real, the truth, over anything that is fleeting and is temporary of this abode, of this world that we occupy. So we were reading from the section looking at the adab with the nafs, the adab with oneself. And we contrasted what our ulama have stated regarding this a little bit with kind of the whole self-help, life coach, guru, love thyself sort of thing. And I think inevitably often if it is not done from a authoritative, tried and proven spiritual tradition, then more often than not it descends into not the adab with the ego, or the etiquette with the ego, but more about pampering the ego and letting the ego partake in its indulgences and its pleasures in order to achieve some sort of therapeutic high, as it were, rather than seeing what's actually best for the nafs, best for the soul, best for the human condition, though it may be bitter at times. So yes, sometimes we have to deal with the bitterness of being patient with a situation and being forbearant with a situation. And that bitterness can turn into sweetness once we realize that the one whose affair is completely with him, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has the ability to change any situation from bitter to sweet, and from difficult to ease, and from excruciating to blissful. So we should put all of our trust in Allah Azza wa Jal. So we talked a little bit about qana'ah yesterday, about conviction, as he mentioned, to be contented with one's circumstances, and we went into that a little bit. The next part, which is the last section here, where he says, رضي الله عنه, ويتفرع من الأدب مع النفس أيضا اطلاع نظر البصيرة على عيوب النفس وذبيب ضميرها إلى الخيانة، فإن القلب هو بيت فيه جواهر ويواقيت رفيعة نفيسة، والعقل رب البيت، والنفس أيضا ربة البيت، فإذا غفل رب البيت عن البيت سرقت ربة البيت المتاع، فلا أمان ولا راحة لرب البيت من أجل خيانة ربة البيت، فإذا كان السارق من أهل البيت توعرت حراسته، ولا سيما إذا كان السارق محبوبا لا يستطاع فراقه. So, also connected with the etiquette or the comportment of the nafs, اطلاع نظر البصيرة على عيوب النفس. And this in of itself, books have been written about it. It's kind of a whole subgenre within the genre of spiritual purification. In other words, looking at one's shortcomings and busying oneself with one's shortcomings. Perhaps most famously, Imam Abu Abdullah as-Sulami, who was an early spiritual doctor of the mid-5th century, if I'm not mistaken, of the Hijrah. And he has this book called Uyub al-Nafs wa Dawa'uha, the shortcomings of the soul and its medicine and how to remedy it. And he has about 68 to 70 different uyub, different shortcomings of the nafs, and how one would go about countering it. So he includes things like anger, he includes things like hubb al-jah, love of to be lauded and to have prestige and status and so forth. So one of the adab with the nafs is ittila' nadhr al-basira. So your basira, take your spiritual insight and use it to counter uyub al-nafs, your own shortcomings. And that in of itself requires a prior step, which means you have to acknowledge you have shortcomings to begin with. So even the greatest of the awliya, they all admit they have shortcomings. But what we consider to be, or what they consider to be shortcomings, for us are not shortcomings. They seem to be pinnacles of faith and of spirituality and of contentment with Allah's decree and so forth. But at every maqam, at every level, one will find particular things that they can always improve upon. So if the object of the ma'rifah, in other words, الذي يعرف أو المعلوم هو Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so Allah is the one that we want to know, and Allah is infinite in terms of His ata, in terms of what He can give us and what we can know about Him, then also overcoming those particular shortcomings to reach a higher level or understanding or profound understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also can always use improvement. So you might also find a little bit of this spoken about in some of the books that talk about the different types of darajat and nufus. So the three souls that are mentioned in the Quran, for example, النفس الأمارة بالسوء والنفس اللوامة والنفس المطمئنة. And then some of them, like Sayyid Abdul Qadir Jilani, I think was one of the first, looked at them as 7. So they began with the nafs al-amara bis-su', right, the one that is constantly commanding you and trying to goad you into doing su', into doing evil. And then it could graduate from that into a nafs al-lawama, right? So from the inciting soul to the blaming soul. So sometimes it does right, sometimes it does wrong, it feels guilty when it does wrong, but nevertheless it's kind of difficult to get out of that. And then from the nafs al-lawama to an-nafs al-mulhama. And they say here at the nafs al-mulhama, or the inspired soul, is the beginning of the steps towards wilaya, right? So the beginning of the steps towards having a khususiyya, having of a more special relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So nafs al-amara bis-su' and nafs al-lawama are kind of the vast majority of people out there, vacillate between those two things. And then in nafs al-mulhama, the inspired soul, is one that once you get to it from the nafs al-lawama, from the blameworthy or the blaming soul, then it is just raf'at darajat. So the veils then that go from a nafs al-mulhama and then onto النفس المطمئنة ثم النفس الراضية ثم المرضية ثم الكاملة, those 7. So going through all of those, then it becomes, rather than having veils that are opaque, there are veils of light. So the hujab, rather than being dhulmaniya, which when you go for, when you're nafs al-amara bis-su' or nafs al-lawama, then you go on to a nafs al-mulhama, the inspired soul, and then they become veils of light. So and kind of to summarize, what does that mean, a veil of light? It means kind of thinking you've arrived when there's other things that you can know and that you can encounter and that you can acquire, and then going through that. So, and the hardest step is going from a nafs al-lawama to a nafs al-mulhama, right, where you have more of a sustained, if I had to draw like a graph that looks like where our iman goes for most people, it's kind of like, up, down, valleys, hills, up, down, kind of like that. And for the nafs al-mulhama and the others after it, al-mutma'inna, wal-radiyya, wal-mardiyya, wal-kamila, it's kind of like, a steady increase like that, I would suppose. So getting to the nafs al-mulhama requires that one has to acknowledge you have uyub, that you have shortcomings, and that you have failings, and that these failings will come out in how you deal with people and how you deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what it requires is introspection, which is basically what he's saying here. نظر البصيرة على عيوب النفس وذبيب ضميرها إلى الخيانة. Right, so an introspection, and also to be aware the subtlety in the treacherous nature of the nafs. Right, because it doesn't want to openly admit to you, oh yeah, I have shortcomings, and here they are, 1, 2, 3, let's go tackle them together. No, it'll kind of do the opposite and say, no, you were justified in that response that you had to that person. They escalated it first, and so, you were completely justified in, publicly outing them and humiliating them and doing whatever that you felt justified in doing, because they certainly deserved it, and they're not a good person, and, they forced you to do it, and and all of these justifications that come about. So one of, I'd say, the attributes also of this nafs al-mulhama, or the inspired soul, or the one who's acquainted with their ayub, is that you start going from a reactive kind of demeanor with things around you to a more proactive one. In other words, one that is based upon mabadi', one that is based upon well-grounded, well-rooted principles, rather than reacting in kind to whatever is happening out there. And the Prophet ﷺ, he told the Sahaba, لا تكونوا كالإمعة. And they said, so what is this imma'? What does that mean? Or he told them, he explained to them, don't be like the imma', the one who says, in أحسن الناس أحسننا, وإن ظلم الناس ظلمنا. Right? If people are good, we'll be good. And if people are bad, then we'll be bad. He said, rather, وَطِّنُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِكُمْ إِنْ أَحْسَنَ أَحْسَنْتُمْ وَإِنْ ظَلَمَ النَّاسِ فَلَا تَظْلِمُوا. If people are good, you are good too. وَهَلْ جَزَاءُ الْإِحْسَانِ إِلَّا الْإِحْسَانِ. But if also people in ظَلَمُوا, if they corrupt, or if they go a path of destruction and evil, فَلَا تَظْلِمُوا. Then do not respond in kind. It does not give you a justification to also be zalim, right? To go beyond bounds and to put things out of their place. Rather, have a demeanor and a way of dealing with the world and with creation and with people based upon your morality and your morals and your ethics and your principles, rather than a reaction. And if you think that when there's such a situation that it can be dire enough that it requires a suspension of acting upon your principles, then you don't understand the principle. That's the very reason you have a principle to begin with. It's quite easy to be nice and good, جُبِلَتِ النَّاسَ عَلَى حُبِّ مَنْ أَحْسَنَ إِلَيْهَا. The nufus have been accustomed to loving those who are good to it. So that's not really a test of your character. The test of your character comes when you're dealing with people who are not so good, who are not so nice, and you, on top of that, have the ability to exact a response that is not bounded by any limit except your own restraint. Here then is the true measure of the person. Right? And when we see the divine attributes, وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَفُوًّا قَدِيرًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions al-afu ma'al qudra. So the ability to pardon someone at the same time with the ability to exact whatever you want upon them, but nevertheless you choose afu, you choose to pardon them, then is a sign, and it's a kind of a divine attribute, that yuslah lit-takhalluq, that we can also take for ourselves. So maybe you can exact a response on that person with impunity. No one's going to stop you. No one's going to have a second thought about it. And usually this comes out in subordinates. So like somebody who works for you, or someone who you consider to be a servant, or like a maid or a waiter or waitress at the restaurant, or the stewardess or the steward on the airplane. So sometimes it comes out in things like this, in the way that we act with these people, because we think we can act with impunity. And especially if we think we have a right to treat them whatever they want because they're supposed to serve us. So the true character of a person then will come out there. And if you find yourself slipping in those particular situations, and not slipping in situations where, like, someone above you is kind of rattling your cage and you don't do anything in response, well, that's based upon fear. That's not character. You can't do anything. You're not in a position to do anything to exact the response that you want. But when you are, but nevertheless you go beyond bounds, then that's a true test of the character. So the nafs is treacherous. And he gives a nice metaphor here. He says, فَإِنَّ الْقَلْبَ هو بيت فيه جواهر ويواقيت رفيعة نفيسة. So the heart, the spiritual heart, it's the house, and it has jawahir and yawaqit. It has jewels and rubies and precious gems. رفيعة نفيسة, right? Very precious and of high value. والعقل رب البيت. And the intellect, here in this scenario, is the Rabb of the Bayt, the master of the house, so to speak, the head of the house. وَالنَّفْسُ أَيْضًا رَبَّةُ الْبَيْتِ. But the nafs, or the ego, also has a role. هي رَبَّةُ الْبَيْتِ. So here masculine and feminine doesn't mean like husband and wife, because nafs is, it's feminine in the Arabic language. So he says رَبَّةُ الْبَيْتِ على أساس that it's a co-owner or a co-leader in this house. So you have two of them. You have the intellect and you have the nafs, and they're both competing or living in the heart that is also filled with yawaqit and jawahir, that's filled with jewels and rubies and precious gems. فإذا غفل رب البيت عن البيت سرقت ربة البيت المتاع. So if the intellect here, who is the co-head of the house, loses interest or is remiss or is negligent and is not paying attention, then the nafs, who is the other part of the house, or the other leader of the house, then can steal those treasures that are in the house. اليواقيت والجواهر, the rubies and the diamonds and the precious gems. فلا أمان ولا راحة لرب البيت من أجل خيانة ربة البيت. So there's no pause or rest for the intellect as long as the nafs is around and can steal things like that. Always have to be on top of things. فإذا كان السارق من أهل البيت توعرت حراسته ولا سيما إن كان السارق محبوبا لا يستطاع فراقه. If the one who is stealing, namely the nafs, is also from the household, then it becomes more difficult to have hirasa. Then it becomes more difficult to, to keep tabs and to keep watch. لا سيما, especially if this thief, namely the nafs, is mahbub, is beloved. لا يستطاع فراقه. And that's our nafs, right? The nafs, it doesn't ask us to do things we dislike, actually. It wants us to do things we like. So things that taste good, things that look good, things that sound good. And it doesn't really care about the sharia. It doesn't care about whether it can have detrimental ramifications afterwards or not, whether in the dunya, in the akhirah, or both in the dunya and the akhirah. That's not important. The important thing is to satiate that appetite and to achieve and realize the raghabat, right? Whatever it is interested in. And that's a beloved thing to us. And it's not an easy thing to say no to. So this hirasa, that we can also call muraqaba, which you can also call vigilance, to be ever vigilant. And the easiest way or the best way to be ever vigilant is to be aware that Allah is ever vigilant of you. So Allah is your raqib. He's also watching you. So you watch your nafs and be aware that Allah is also watching you. So then he goes on to فصل ما يتفرع من الأدب مع الخلق. Now we're going to look to the adab with the khalq, with creation. So we'll read a little bit of that. I don't know how much we're going to get through of it. ويتفرع من الأدب مع الخلق تساوي نفسك وأهلك وولدك مع الخلق في الحق عند ورود مرارة أحكام الحق ولو كان مرا لا يوافق طباع النفوس. So he says the first thing that we understand of this adab, this etiquette with creation, with everything else, تساوي نفسك وأهلك وولدك, would be the equality of yourself and of your family and of your children with everybody else. When it comes to al-haq, right? When it comes to what's right. عند ورود مرارة أحكام الحق. When it comes even down to what is right, and it may be a bitter pill for you to swallow. He even says the word bitter, right? It may be bitter for you to swallow. ولو كان مرا, even if it's bitter, لا يوافق طباع النفوس. So you put yourself, or you put your family, and you put your children in that same level as everybody else. So you don't show a preference to them or for them when it contradicts what is haqq, what is right, when it includes rights of people. So If you, if you run a business and you have this young person who's working for you, and they're doing quite a great job, but then you have a child or a son or a daughter that is kind of, not doing too much, and you just want to give them a job, and you can't pay both, so you fire the person who's doing well, and you give the job to your son or your daughter or your relative. A kind of nepotism, as they would call it. That may be a simple example of how there was a mirara, there was a bitterness, you don't like the situation with the child, but then you usurped the haqq, you usurp the right of somebody else in order to show preference for something that goes back to you. So he includes children and family here because it goes back to preference for yourself because of their connection to you. وهذه دقيقة صعبة تنفر منها النفوس ويعجز عنها الرجال. He said this is a very difficult, fine point. دقيقة صعبة تنفر منها النفوس. Most people run away from it, right? Very difficult to implement. ويعجز عنها الرجال, and most people are not capable of actually doing it. لا يقتحمها ولا يذعن لها إلا مشايخ العارفين. No one actually delves into it and applies this principle and follows it and submits to it إلا مشايخ العارفين. Not just أي عارف, not just the عارفين, مشايخ العارفين. The ones who have قطعوا شوط, people who are well in there on the path. So mashayikh doesn't necessarily mean sheikh as in advanced in age or a sheikh like a scholar, but mashayikh al-arifin, yani people who are well versed in ma'rifah. They understand it and they understand where the priorities are. ولا يلتذ بها ولا يستظل بظلها إلا ولي أو روحاني أو صديق. No one will take its shade and no one will find pleasure in it. This daqiqah, this fine point here, إلا الولي, one of the friends of Allah, أو روحاني, a very highly spiritual person, أو صديق, or someone who has the utmost sincerity. In other words, someone of a high spiritual state. فإن إنزال النفس والأهل والولد مع الخلق في الحق بمنزلة واحدة بوجود لذة التسوية من أفعال المقربين. So to put yourself and your family and everyone else in manzila wahida, at one level, like everybody else, this is min af'al al-muqarrabin. This is from the acts and the deeds of the muqarrabin, those that Allah brings closest to Him. وفي فقد تسوية النفس والأهل والولد مع الخلق في الحق نقص في حق الصفي والولي والصديق. And for someone who doesn't do that, then this is a type of naqs. It's a shortcoming with the khalq, with creation, in terms of someone who is a safi or a wali or a siddiq. Was-safi wal-wali almost the same. Was-safi is a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, someone who has pure intentions. Some of them made a distinction between a safi wal-wali. I think Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq في القواعد, he said it's safi ليس له تصرف والولي له تصرف. So the wali is someone who has something called tasrif or tasarruf, يعني mustajab al-da'wah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kind of more readily answers their dua. And the safi is someone maybe not so much so and has trials and tribulations, but is still of a very high maqam. Was-siddiq, like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, is the highest, is the one with the utmost sincerity. كما قيل أن نوحا عليه السلام لما أشرف ابنه على الغرق قال رب إن ابني من أهلي فأوحى الله عز وجل إليه خصصت ولدك دون سائر عبادي وابنك واحد منهم إني أعظك أن تكون من الجاهلين في أن تقضي حقك على الخصوص وتهمل حقوق عبادي أجمعهم. انظر أيها المسكين إلى نوح عليه السلام وهو من الصفوة وأولي العزم من الرسل، نصح الله عز وجل في خلقه واحتمل أذاهم وحرص على هداهم 1000 سنة إلا 50 عاما، ثم قال إن ابني من أهلي، فعُتب عليه فأبكاه ذلك 40 سنة فيما قيل، فلما اشتد عليه كرب ذلك قال ولا تغفر لي وترحمني أكن من الخاسرين. لعمرك ما تحقق أهل الحق بالحق حتى عذب عندهم مذاق مرات أحكام الحق ولم يروا في الوجود إلا الله وأفعاله وذلك من شيم مشايخ العارفين. So he includes here a moral lesson from the story of Noah, alayhi salam, when he talks about faqd al-taswiya, right, an example of not putting your family and your children at the same level as everyone else. He says, when the son of Noah, أشرف ابنه على الغرق, when his son was almost about to drown, and we know in the Quran that Nuh alayhi salam said to his son, يا بني اركب معنا ولا تكن من الغافلين. يا بني اركب معنا, come with us on the ark. What did he say to him? إني سآوي إلى جبل يعصمني من الماء قال لا عاصم اليوم من أمر الله. He said, I will go to a mountain, I'll climb a mountain, it will save me from the flood. And then either Allah or Nuh said back to him, لا عاصم اليوم من أمر الله. There is no protection from the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this day. So when he was about to drown, then Nuh says to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, رَبِّ إِنَّ أَبْنِي مِنْ أَهْلِي وَإِنَّ وَعْدَكَ الْحَقِّ. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him, everyone would be saved from your family. So then he responded back to Allah, رَبِّ إِنَّ أَبْنِي مِنْ أَهْلِي. My son is from my family. فَأَوْحَى اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ إِلَيْهِ. And then Allah revealed to him, خَصَصْتَ وَلَدَكَ دُونَ سَائِرِ عِبَادِي. You spoke about your son, and you took interest in your son, دُونَ سَائِرِ عِبَادِي. And you didn't consider the rest of the people, you're only asking about your son, in terms of the people who were drowning. وَابْنُكَ وَاحِدٌ مِّنْهُمْ. And your son is one of them. إِنِّي أَعِذُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. This was Allah's response in the Quran. إِنِّي أَعِذُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. I warn you to not be from amongst the jahilin, those who are ignorant. في أن تقضي, and this is the tafsir of al-Lajai, his understanding, في أن تقضي حقك على خصوص وتهمل حقوق عبادي أجمعهم بأجمعهم. So don't be from those ignorant who seek your own and individual right to be fulfilled وتهمل, and then you are remiss or negligent in the rights of all the rest of the ibad, all the rest of the servants of Allah. انظر أيها المسكين لنوح عليه السلام. Now Lajai is speaking to us. يا مسكين, poor one. Look at Nuh عليه السلام. وهو من الصفوة وأولي العزم من الرسل. He's of the greatest people who ever lived. من الصفوة وأولي العزم, and he's from the 5 of the greatest prophets. نصح الله عز وجل في خلقه. Right? He spent many years in da'wah, actually 950. نصح, in other words, he was counseling people, inviting them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. واحتمل أذاهم, and how much did he tolerate from them all those years, all those centuries. وحرص على هداهم. Right? And it's said that in some of the tafsir that Nuh, he lived so long, but not everybody lived as long as him. And so he would be speaking to the grandchildren of the grandparents who rejected him. And then the grandchildren would say, yeah, we heard about you, our grandparents told us that you this person who talks these tales, and we're not going to listen to you. And so it was kind of even an intergenerational thing, one generation after the another. واحتمل أذاهم, so he tolerated them. وحرص على هداهم ألف سنة إلا 50 عاما. Right? And he was steadfast in trying to guide them for 950 years. ثم قال, then he says to Allah, إن ابني من أهلي. Then he said, my son is from my family. فعوتب عليه. Right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala عاتبه. So we say that there's a type of itab, a type of admonition that can come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to his prophets and messengers. And if you recall from the session we did on prophetology, which maybe I think was session 15 or 6 or 7 sessions ago, we went into more detail about this. So review that if you have some questions about it. فعوتب, so عاتبه, he had admonished him. فأبكاه ذلك 40 سنة. And then it said that he wept about it for 40 years. فيما قيل, in that which has been said. فلما اشتد عليه كرب ذلك قال. And so when it got really severe, then he said to Allah, وَلَّا تَغْفِرْ لِي وَتَرْحَمْنِي أَكُنْ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. And if you do not forgive me and have mercy upon me, then I will be from those of the khasirin, those who have lost. Then Al-Lajai is speaking back to us, لَعَمْرُكَ مَا تَحَقَّقَ أَهْلُ الْحَقِّ بِالْحَقِّ حَتَّى عَذُبَ عَنْدُهُمْ مَذَاقُ مِرَاتِ الْأَحْكَامِ الْحَقِّ وَلَمْ يَرَوْا فِي الْوُجُودِ إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَأَفْعَلَهُ. So لَعَمْرُكَ, it's like almost, it's like by your life, ما تحقق أهل الحق. The people of haqq, the people of the truth and reality, did not actualize it and realize the haqq, the truth and reality, حتى, until عذب عندهم مذاق مرات الأحكام الحق, until that which in essence may taste bitter from ahkam al-haq, in other words, the ahkam and the ahkam al-haq, the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are two types. There's ahkam al-taklifiyya, so when Allah tells you pray, fast, hajj, these are ahkam taklifiyya. You have to do it. And then there's al-ahkam al-takwiniyya, right, and nawazil, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tries and is a source of tribulation for you. Loss of things. وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ. Loss of life and profit and loss of things. So when can you have this realization? تَتَحَقَّقْ بِالْحَقِّ وَأَنْتَ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْحَقِّ. You are from the people of haqq, from the people of the utmost truth and reality, and you embody the utmost truth and reality. How do you know? When do you get to that? حَتَّى عَذُبَ. Right? عَذُبَ. It becomes that which was bitter now becomes pure from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ينزل عليك من الأحكام, from those type of rulings that come down upon you. And we said in a previous session, if you think 2 and 3 times about a ruling that you find that is mujma alayhi, right, that has consensus of the ummah about it, and you feel like you don't want to practice it or put it into practice because you're not convinced it's right, then you're not worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're worshipping yourself. You're worshipping your intellect, or you're worshipping your understanding. So you're putting your understanding as a barrier between you and al-haq. That's not going to work. And by the same token, if you question every nazila, if you question every difficult thing that comes down upon you in your life, and you say, why me? And you don't understand it, and you feel like you can't properly deal with it until you understand it, then you've also put a barrier between you and al-haq. Then you have put your understanding, your quote-unquote understanding, between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the people who are the mashayikh al-arifin, as he says here, حَتَّى عَذُبَ عِنْدَهُمْ مَذَاقُ مَرَاتِ أَحْكَامِ الْحَقِّ, until the bitterness of the judgments and rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have now become pure when they were before they were bitter. وَلَمْ يَرَوْا فِي الْوُجُودِ, and they did not see anything in existence إِلَّا اللَّهَ وَأَفْعَالَهُ. They see nothing in existence except Allah and His acts. So that means everything is an act of God. And if everything is an act of God and goes back to God, then why would I have an objection to it? Then my job then, our job then, is to accept it, is to acquiesce to it, is to accept the decree, and then see muradullah. Right? What is the murad? What is Allah seeking in this particular thing? And fi hada nashtahid. Right? And that we struggle and we strive and we try to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَذَلِكَ مِنْ شِيَمْ مَشَايِخِ الْعَارِفِينَ. This is from the shiyam, or from the attributes or the properties of the mashayikh of the arifin, of the those who are well versed in ma'rifah. ويتفرع من الأدب مع الخلق أيضا طرح ما يستقبح من أخلاقهم عن أخلاقك، والاقتداء بأهل العلم والبصائر منهم، وليس كل عالم يقتدى به، فإن العلماء على ضربين: ضرب أول عالم صحيح القلب سالم البصيرة والبصر من غشاوة حب الدنيا، مستغرق في حب الدار الآخرة، منزه النفس عن دناءة الأخلاق، مستخف بالدنيا في أكثر أوقاته، هارب من المحارم والشبهات، مستظل بظل الورع، فهذا صنف واجب اتباعه واقتداء به. وضرب ثان عالم باللسان جاهل بالقلب والجنان. So he says يتفرع من الأدب مع الخلق, also included from the adab with the خلق, is طرح ما يستقبح من أخلاقهم عن أخلاقك. So that which is ugly from the character traits of people, طرح, to be forsaken, to be abandoned, not to be followed. والاقتداء بأهل العلم والبصائر منهم, but rather following and emulating بِأَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ, those who are of knowledge, and basair, and of spiritual insight from amongst them. These are the people we want to emulate, not the people that we read about on yahoo.com and msn.com and, who's dating who and, which celebrity is quarantining with other celebrity during the COVID and, how much their new coach purse cost and did they wear it to Disneyland or not. ليس هؤلاء إنما الاقتداء بأهل العلم والبصائر, to follow the people of knowledge and بصيرة, بصائر, spiritual insight. وليس كل عالم يقتدى به, and not everyone who seems knowledgeable or scholarly should be followed. فإن العلماء على ضربين. He says there's two types of علماء. ضرب أول, the first type, عالم صحيح القلب سالم البصيرة والبصر من غشاوة حب الدنيا. So, a alim, a knowledgeable person, a wise person, sahih al-qalbi, of a valid and healthy spiritual heart, salim al-basira wal-basar, and also to have a valid and healthy basira, spiritual insight, min ghishawat hubb ad-dunya, especially from what? From the darkness of the love of the dunya. This is what will drive people to do what they want to do. And dunya is not just the acquiring of material possessions. Dunya also means acquisition of hearts. Istimalat al-qulub. Right? And this is probably the bane of those people who seem like to be scholarly, but they have some spiritual issues. So if they yastamiluna al-qulub, if they like to have followers and they like to have people following them and people being in their circle and people, applauding them and lauding them and so forth, then this is a sign, maybe this is not the person to follow. If they may have those followings, that doesn't disqualify them, but it depends on how they feel about it, what's in their heart. مستغرق في حب الدار الآخرة. Right, this alim al-sahih is مستغرق, or she is مستغرق, is completely immersed in the love of the dar al-akhirah, of the next abode, the last one. منزه النفس عن دناءة الأخلاق. Right, and they appropriate themselves to all of the good character traits, not the dana'at al-akhlaq, not the worst of them. مستخف بالدنيا في أكثر أوقاته. Right, doesn't think much of the dunya most of the time. هارب من المحارم والشبهات, forsakes and runaways from things that are haram, والشبهات, and things that are ambiguous, things of an ambiguous nature. مستظل بظل الورع. Right, they take the shade of scrupulousness. Right, they rather be on the safe side and be involved in something that's ambiguous. فهذا صنف واجب اتباعه والاقتداء به. These categories, we have to follow them, we have to emulate them, and we have to take them as our exemplars. وضرب ثاني, and the other type, عالم باللسان جاهل بالقلب والجنان. And the other one is عالم باللسان. So they're knowledgeable with their tongue, they speak very well, they're quite eloquent, they're charismatic, they can talk about the finer points of many things. ولكن جاهل بالقلب والجنان. But in terms of their inner spiritual knowledge, there's jahal. Right? And jahal means that they haven't quite overcome themselves yet. If their nafs wins out most of the time in that internal battle and that internal struggle, then they only have their allotment is al-ilm bil-lisan, is what they have with the tongue. May Allah protect us from that. So the next sections he's going to go into what does this jahl al-qalb mean, this ignorance of the heart, and he'll finish that out, and we'll probably do that on our next session. We'll complete that bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll stop here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.